Stop. Don't scroll because someone needs to finally tell you the truth you were never supposed to discover. They didn't pull away because you were unworthy. They pulled away because loving you terrified them. And I know no one has said this to you in a way that actually felt real. You've heard the clichés, the hollow comfort, the just move on advice spoken by people who have never been shattered by silence. But you know exactly what it feels like when an avoidant partner looks you in the eyes, sees everything. You are everything you offer, everything you would have given them, and then pretends you don't matter. You know the sting of watching someone who once held you with trembling devotion suddenly act like they barely know your name. That level of emotional whiplash breaks people in a way most can't understand. So hear this with every nerve in your body. You are not crazy. You are not dramatic. You are not too much. You are a human being whose heart has been stretched to its breaking point. To decipher the emotional riddles of someone who is terrified of needing you. Today, I'm going to give you the map they never gave you. The truth behind the emotional disappearance. Act, the hidden logic behind their distance. And most importantly, the power you forgot you still hold. Because their silence isn't the end of your story. It's the moment you stop begging for crumbs and start reclaiming continence. Let's begin. There's a moment avoidant partners never admit exists, that split second right after you get close enough to touch the part of them they've guarded their entire life. In that moment, something ancient inside them wakes up, something built long before you arrived, forged in childhood, shaped by disappointment, sharpened by emotional neglect. And when you finally reach that hidden place, even with the best intention, even with pure love, you trigger an alarm they don't consciously understand. Most people think avoidants pull away because they don't care. But the truth is far more twisted. They pull away because caring feels dangerous, because attachment feels like exposure, because you represent a level of closeness they were never taught to survive. To you, intimacy feels warm, natural, necessary. It's the oxygen of connection. To them, it feels like a trap door beneath their feet. That's why their withdrawal feels so sudden, so surgical. One day they're laughing with you, sharing inside jokes, letting you into their private world in a way you know they don't do with just anyone. And then, as if on cue, they vanish. The real person evaporates. You're left negotiating with a cold silhouette. You think, was it something I said? Did I push too hard? Did I scare them? Did I misread everything? But here's the truth you need to swallow. Even if it burns, you didn't do anything wrong. You touched something too right. You crossed the invisible line they don't even know how to explain. The boundary between this feels good and this feels like dependence. And dependence to them feels like walking back into childhood where emotional needs were a liability, not a doorway. So they do what they've always done. They retreat into emotional armor. They numb themselves. They detach so quickly it feels like betrayal. They pretend you don't matter, even when your absence rattles them. And yes, it rattles them. They feel your loss like a ghost leaning against their chest. They feel the pull, the longing, the ache for you, but the moment that ache rises, they smother it. Avoidance isn't absence of feeling. It's war against feeling. What destroys you isn't their distance, it's the lie they hide behind it, the blank expression, the nonchalant tone, the I'm fine, I don't need anyone posture. The cold silence that hits you harder than any shouted argument. This isn't indifference. This is fear wearing a mask of indifference, because fear is the one emotion they will never admit exists. And if you've been blaming yourself, let this be the moment the blame dies. Think about it. If they truly didn't care, why would closeness shake them? Why would your vulnerability feel overwhelming to them? Why would they need emotional walls twice as thick when they're with you than with anyone else? They pretend not to care because caring threatens the walls that once protected them. And you, with your depth, your honesty, your emotional fluency, are the one person who slipped past their defenses long enough to make them feel something real. But here's the part they will never confess. They didn't retreat because you're too much. They retreated because you awakened the part of them that's been asleep for years. An awakening hurts. It destabilizes everything they've built. It shakes the identity they crafted around self-reliance. It exposes desires they worked their whole life to suppress. So instead of stepping toward you, they choose the only safety they understand: distance. You keep trying to solve their silence with louder love. But that's not what breaks the spell. What breaks it is understanding this truth. Their avoidance is their story, not your reflection. You cannot fix an emotional wound that predates your existence. You cannot negotiate with fear disguised as strength. You cannot rescue someone who's still running from the memory of needing anyone, but you can wake up from the trance of self-blame. You can stop taking their withdrawal as a sign of your failure. You can reclaim the worth you accidentally handed over while trying to understand their chaos. In the end, the disappearing act is their attempt to survive emotions they've never learned to hold. You were never the problem. You were the catalyst. And catalysts don't apologize for creating change. There's a grief sitting inside avoidant partners that they never acknowledge, not because they're incapable of feeling it, but because naming it would unravel the identity they've spent their entire life constructing. And you unknowingly stepped right into that grief. Not by saying something wrong, not by demanding too much, but simply by offering a kind of emotional closeness they were never trained to metabolize. Most people imagine avoidance as cold, unbothered, detached, statues carved from ice who drift through relationships untouched. But that isn't the truth. The truth is far more tragic, far more human, far more painful. Avoidants feel deeply, so deeply, in fact, that they learned early on to shut down their own needs, because expressing them didn't lead to comfort, it led to disappointment. Think of what that does to a young mind. Imagine being a child who reaches out for soothing and receives silence. Imagine learning that your vulnerability is invisible. Imagine your heart needing something no one ever thought to give you, not because you weren't worth it, but because the people around you didn't know how to provide it. That kind of emotional starvation doesn't disappear when someone grows up. It calcifies. It becomes a philosophy, a rule book, a survival mechanism so embedded that they don't even realize they're following it. So when you enter their life with warmth and attunement, when you actually see them, it awakens something devastating. The grief of a lifetime of unmet needs. Grief for the closeness they never learned to hold. Grief for the love that slipped through their fingers before they even knew how to grasp it. Grief for the intimacy they secretly crave but have no idea how to sustain. Grief for the safety they've never felt in another human being. And here's the heartbreaking twist. Your presence exposes the wound they've spent decades concealing. Your affection illuminates the emptiness they worked so hard to bury. Your stability highlights the instability within them. They don't avoid you. They avoid the pain you unconsciously bring to the surface, a pain they've been running from since childhood. That's why their pullback feels so bewildering. One moment they lean in, drawn to your warmth, like a starving person inhaling the scent of food. The next moment they recoil as if closeness is fire. It's not because you did something wrong. It's because being close to you reminds them of everything they never got. When you offer consistency, it exposes inconsistency. When you offer presence, it reminds them of absence. When you offer connection, it activates their deepest fear. That connection, in the end, always disappears. And instead of confronting that grief, instead of letting it breathe, instead of allowing themselves to receive the love you're capable of giving, they retreat into emotional anesthesia. They choose distance because it numbs the ache. They choose silence because words would expose too much. They choose indifference because indifference is easier than admitting they care so much it scares them. You think they don't feel the loss when they step back from you, but they do in ways you'll never see, in ways they'll never articulate, in ways that twist their insides long after they pretend to be fine. Avoidants grieve the connection even while they're running from it. They grieve you. They grieve what they know they're destroying. They grieve the closeness they want, but cannot hold without feeling like they're drowning. But here's the most painful part. They think they don't deserve what you're offering. Not because you failed them, but because somewhere deep inside, a voice they never questioned whispers that love is conditional. Affection disappears, and people leave long before you ever get the chance to rely on them. So what do? They self-abandon before anyone else can. They reject intimacy before intimacy can reject them. They sabotage the bond so they don't have to watch it collapse later. And you're left there, confused, heartbroken, trying to translate the silence of someone who doesn't even understand their own emotions. But let me tell you something few people ever say out loud. You are not responsible for rescuing someone from grief they refuse to acknowledge. You cannot heal a wound that is still being denied. You cannot outlove someone's fear of needing love. But you can recognize what's happening without shaming yourself for it. Recognition is liberation. Understanding is release. The moment you realize their avoidance isn't proof of your inadequacy, but evidence of their unresolved grief, you stop internalizing their withdrawal as rejection. You stop seeing their silence as judgment. You stop letting their emotional patterns mold your sense of worth. You begin to understand that you walked into a heart shaped by abandonment. And no matter how gentle your hands were, that heart wasn't ready to be held. Their grief isn't yours to absorb. Their emotional ghosts aren't yours to fight. Their fear of closeness isn't yours to fix. You are not the cure for their childhood. You are the witness of their struggle, nothing more, nothing less. And understanding the truth frees you from carrying the weight of their emotional history on your shoulders. You didn't fail them. You didn't break them. You didn't push them away. You revealed their grief. And grief does what grief always does when it goes unhealed. It retreats into darkness. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from loving an avoidant partner. A pain that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but internally feels like your spirit is being slowly scraped by something you can't name. It's the pain of having someone pull back from you, not with cruelty, not with malice, but with a hollow neutrality that feels like erasure. And even though you logically know their distance is rooted in their fear, emotionally, it feels like a verdict on your worth. That's the psychological trap most people don't understand. To the outside world, an avoidant pulling away is just someone needing space. To you, it feels like invisibility. It feels like someone is slowly unchoosing you without ever saying the words. This is why their distance hits so hard, because they withdraw in silence. And silence forces you to fill in the blanks with self-blame. We are wired to interpret changes in connection as danger. Humans survived for thousands of years by intuitively noticing when a partner, tribe member, or ally pulled away. Emotional withdrawal used to mean you were at risk of abandonment or rejection, both life-threatening in ancient times. So when an avoidant changes their tone, delays their responses, stops showing affection, or suddenly becomes vague, your nervous system doesn't say, "Oh, they must be anxious about intimacy." It says, "I'm losing someone who matters." It says, "Something is wrong with me." It says, "I must have done something." It says, "Fix this before I'm alone." It feels personal because your biology interprets distance as danger. But their distance is not about your value. It's about their threshold. Most people don't realize avoidants have an extremely low tolerance for emotional activation. When intimacy increases, their inner system becomes overwhelmed, not because you're too intense, but because they weren't taught how to regulate closeness. Imagine never building muscle, then suddenly having to lift emotional weight. Of course, they'd collapse under it. But instead of admitting sensitivity, avoidants often present the opposite, a facade of control, a facade of indifference, a facade of emotional minimalism. To protect themselves, they act like nothing affects them. And that performance hits you like a weapon. Because you're left believing you're the only one who feels anything. You're left believing the connection meant more to you than to them. You're left believing they walked away because you didn't matter. But here's the truth they never say out loud. Avoidants distance themselves not because they feel too little, but because they feel too much and don't know how to process any of it. Their internal wiring misidentifies closeness as emotional suffocation. Your warmth triggers their survival instinct. Your love feels like pressure. Not because you're demanding, but because they're terrified of being emotionally accountable. So they run. And the more invested you are, the more personal the distance feels. You replay conversations, analyzing tiny details to find the moment you ruined everything. You shrink yourself, thinking if you become smaller, quieter, easier, maybe they'll return. You start negotiating with your own worth, making excuses for their withdrawal while punishing yourself for caring too deeply. But listen closely. Their withdrawal is not a measurement of how lovable you are. It's a measurement of how overwhelmed they are. You could be perfect. You could be gentle. You could be patient. You could be the safest place they've ever known. And they would still pull back. Not because they're rejecting you, because they're protecting themselves from vulnerability that feels like danger. What feels personal to you feels threatening to them. Your desire for emotional closeness, to them, it feels like losing autonomy. Your need for reassurance, to them, it feels like being responsible for someone else's emotions, a responsibility they don't believe they can fulfill. Your attempts to deepen the bond, to them, it feels like losing the self-reliance that once kept them alive emotionally. So their distance becomes their shield. Their silence becomes their escape. Their indifference becomes their oxygen. And you stand there wondering why wanting someone equals losing yourself. But here's the twist. You don't hurt because they pulled away. You hurt because they acted like the closeness never existed. If they left while admitting they were scared, it would feel human. If they pulled back while acknowledging they still cared, it would feel honest. If they expressed even one sentence of vulnerability, you would feel closure. But they don't do that. They disengage with surgical neutrality. They detach so cleanly, it feels like you imagined the connection. They behave like the intimacy you shared was a story written in erasable ink. And that is the wound. You're grieving someone who refuses to acknowledge the loss. You're hurting over something they pretend didn't happen. You're carrying emotions they never allowed themselves to claim. So yes, it feels personal, but it isn't. It's patterned, predictable, scripted long before you arrived. A reflex, not a rejection. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain, but it frees you from misinterpreting it. You were never the cause. You were the catalyst. Their distance is the echo of old wounds, not the reflection of your worth. And once you truly understand that, something inside you shifts, not in bitterness, not in anger, but in clarity. You stop taking their avoidance as evidence of your inadequacy. You start seeing it as evidence of their limits. There is a moment, a precise, almost invisible shift when loving an avoidant partner stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like combat. Not because you became combative, not because they became cruel, but because the dynamic between you slipped into something neither of you consciously chose, a silent power struggle born from their need for control. Control for an avoidant isn't a desire, it's a lifeline. It's the one thing that makes closeness survivable. It's their subconscious way of ensuring they never again feel powerless, needy, or dependent. States that once left them emotionally abandoned long before you came along. This need for control doesn't look aggressive. It's not loud or obvious. It's subtle, soft, almost unnoticeable until you're tangled in it, so tightly you don't recognize yourself. It shows up in the way they decide the pace of the relationship, how they choose when connection happens and when it doesn't, how they initiate intimacy only when they feel safe, but withdraw the moment you need them. It shows up when they keep conversations shallow, not because they don't care, but because depth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability disrupts control. But the most powerful form of control they wield is emotional distance, because nothing destabilizes you more than absence you can't explain. Nothing unravels your self-esteem faster than silence you can't decode. Nothing creates more self-doubt than affection that evaporates without warning. And here's where the battlefield forms. You start chasing answers, and they retreat further to reclaim control. You want clarity. They want space. You want reassurance. They want autonomy. You want repair. They want relief from the pressure, the closeness, the intensity they aren't prepared to hold. Your attempts to reconnect, completely normal to a secure person, hit them like demands. Your desire to talk things through feels to them like emotional intrusion. Your need for honesty threatens the emotional fortress they've built to stay safe. So they pull back, not just physically but energetically. Their texts become shorter, their tone becomes flatter, their affection becomes inconsistent. Their presence becomes unpredictable. And this unpredictability, it keeps you off balance. It keeps you waiting. It keeps you hoping. It keeps you performing, trimming yourself down, tiptoeing emotionally, trying to be easy, trying not to scare them away again. You stop expressing needs so you don't trigger their retreat. You stop asking questions so you don't seem dramatic. You stop showing vulnerability because vulnerability feels like a liability. And without realizing it, your emotional world becomes organized around managing their triggers. You're not building connection. You're managing turbulence. This is what emotional control looks like when it's quiet. It's not dominance. It's not manipulation in the traditional sense. It's survival. They aren't trying to control you. They're trying to control their fear, their overwhelm, their internal chaos, the rising tide of emotions they don't know how to regulate. But the cost of their survival strategy is your emotional suffocation. Because while they regulate their fear through distance, you regulate your pain through self-abandonment. You shrink so they feel safe. You silence your voice so they don't feel pressured. You hold space for them while they hold nothing for you. And over time, this asymmetry becomes a battlefield where the only weapon is silence and the only casualty is your self-worth. But here's the deeper truth. Avoidant partners use control because unpredictability once controlled them. Their childhood, their early relationships, their emotional landscape, it all taught them that people are inconsistent, affection disappears, warmth reverses without warning. So they became the person who leaves before they can be left, who withdraws before they can be disappointed, who controls closeness so they never again have to feel the free fall of depending on someone else. Their control is not about power, it's about protection. Understanding this doesn't excuse the hurt it causes, but it helps you finally see it for what it is, a defense mechanism, not a personal attack. You are not fighting them. They are fighting their history. They are fighting their memories. They are fighting every moment in their life where a need was ignored or a feeling was denied, and you unknowingly walk right into that emotional battlefield. Your love becomes the mirror that exposes their vulnerability. Your consistency becomes the spotlight that highlights their fear. Your closeness becomes the trigger that threatens the illusion of self-sufficiency. So they take back control in the only way they know how, by creating emotional distance. And you interpret that distance as rejection. But pause, look deeper, separate what feels personal from what is predictable. They are not distancing themselves from you. They are distancing themselves from the part of themselves that feels unsafe in love. You're not the reason they withdraw. You're the reason their fear wakes up. And here is the part most people never tell you. Their need for control is not your responsibility to soothe. Your life was never meant to shrink enough to fit inside someone else's fear. You can understand their patterns. You can empathize with their wounds. You can see the child inside them, who never learned what safety feels like. But you cannot and must not sacrifice your emotional reality to accommodate their fear of theirs. Their love feels like a battlefield because they are fighting to maintain control over emotions that terrify them. But you deserve a love where connection isn't war, where closeness isn't danger, where intimacy isn't a threat. You deserve a partner who doesn't need to retreat to feel secure. And once you understand the source of their control, you reclaim yours. There comes a moment, subtle, quiet, almost anticlimactic, when your heart reaches its limit. Not in a dramatic way, not in anger, not even in sadness. It happens in a single breath, a silent internal shift where something inside you that once clung now simply lets go. And this moment, more than anything you could ever say or do, is what changes the entire dynamic with an avoidant partner. Because avoidants expect you to chase. They expect you to bridge the emotional gap. They expect you to over-explain your feelings. They expect you to apologize first, soften first, bend first. They expect you to fill the space they create with reassurance, patience, and emotional labor. For a long time, you did exactly that, not because you were weak, not because you were needy, but because connection matters to you, because communication matters to you, because you were trying to hold a relationship together that was falling apart on only one side. But avoidance thrives on pursuit, not because they enjoy being chased, but because pursuit allows them to maintain distance without losing connection completely. It lets them feel wanted without feeling obligated. It reassures them of your commitment without requiring them to deepen theirs. It gives them exactly what they want, closeness without vulnerability. It becomes a cycle, a dance you never consciously agreed to perform. They pull back. You move forward. They step away. You close the space. Every time you chase, you unintentionally reinforce their belief that intimacy can be managed without ever confronting their own emotional limits. You become the emotional shock absorber, taking hits that were never yours to carry. But then something changes. Maybe it happens after one too many unanswered messages. Maybe it happens after one more cold tone, one more disappearing act, one more pretend indifference. Maybe it happens because your spirit finally whispers a truth louder than your longing. I cannot keep abandoning myself to hold on to someone who keeps abandoning themselves. And in that moment, the chase ends. You don't announce it. You don't punish them. You don't stage a dramatic exit. You simply stop. You're not angry. You're done feeding a pattern that eats you alive. This is the moment that terrifies avoidants the most, because everything in their world has taught them that if they pull away, you'll move closer. If they create space, you'll fill it. If they retreat, you'll reach. It's a dynamic so predictable, it feels like gravity. But when you stop chasing, you break gravity. You disrupt the pattern. You shatter the expectation. You force their fear to confront a new reality. Distance no longer guarantees safety. Distance now has a cost. For the first time, they feel the emptiness of the space they created. For the first time, your absence becomes loud. For the first time, they realize the connection doesn't survive on autopilot. For the first time, they sense the difference between solitude and loss. Avoidants are used to people trying harder. They're not used to people choosing themselves. And while they may not say it out loud, their nervous system feels the shift immediately. The silence they once used for control becomes suffocating. The distance they once relied on becomes uncomfortable. The independence they once clung to feels oddly hollow, because your presence wasn't the problem. It was the safety they didn't know how to receive. Your love wasn't overwhelming. It was unfamiliar. Your closeness didn't trap them. It illuminated how deeply alone they've been. When you stop chasing, you force reality to reveal itself. You give the avoidant, the one thing they've spent years evading, an opportunity to choose, not react, not retreat, not manipulate the distance. Choose, will they meet you halfway, or will they fall back into their comfort zone of isolation? This is where clarity is born. Because when you stop chasing, you reclaim your power and your absence becomes information. You see who they are when you're not carrying the relationship for both of you. Some avoidants panic. They resurface quickly. They text suddenly. They show uncharacteristic vulnerability, not because they're healed, but because your silence triggered their fear of losing the connection entirely. Others retreat even further, not because you weren't enough, but because choosing intimacy feels like stepping into a fire they aren't ready to walk through. Either way, the truth surfaces when the chase ends. But the most important part of this moment isn't their reaction. It's what happens inside you. When you stop chasing, you stop negotiating with your own worth. You stop trying to earn affection that should have been freely given. You stop confusing emotional breadcrumbs for love. You stop shrinking yourself to avoid triggering someone else's fear. You return to yourself, the part of you that existed before the anxiety, before the confusion, before the emotional contortion. You perform to maintain a fragile bond. You rediscover your voice, your standards, your clarity, your boundaries. And you realize something profound. You were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. And if the avoidant finally steps forward, ready to do the work, ready to face their fear, ready to grow, that's their choice. But if they don't, you no longer crumble. Because the moment you stopped chasing, you stopped bleeding for someone who wasn't willing to stop running. You stepped out of survival mode and into self-respect. And that shift is the most powerful force in the entire dynamic. There comes a moment after witnessing the emotional storms of an avoidant partner, when you finally see the relationship for what it truly was, not a reflection of your inadequacy, but a reflection of their unresolved history. The distance, the silence, the withdrawal, the disappearing acts, none of it was ever proof that you were unworthy or unlovable. These behaviors were the echoes of wounds buried long before you entered their life. And once you understand this truth, your entire perspective shifts. You stop carrying burdens that were never yours. You stop apologizing for needs that were normal. You stop believing the lie that love has to feel like walking through emotional landmines to be real. You begin to see that the pain didn't come from loving them. It came from loving them alone. You were trying to build connection in a space where closeness felt threatening to the other person. You were offering vulnerability to someone who only knew how to survive through emotional containment. You were giving presence to someone who associated intimacy with danger, and while your heart kept reaching, hoping, holding, believing theirs, kept retreating into the old patterns that once kept them safe. The tragedy is that they mistook your love for pressure and their fear for truth. And yet, there is something profoundly powerful in what you went through. Loving someone who is avoidant forces you to confront parts of yourself you didn't know existed. Your tolerance for uncertainty, your tendency to personalize distance, your habit of overfunctioning in relationships, your willingness to shrink so someone else can feel comfortable. It teaches you where your boundaries end and your self-sacrifice begins. It shows you how easily the desire to love can turn into the habit of self-abandonment. And it wakes you up to the truth that staying loyal to someone's potential can cost you your own peace. When you finally step back, not out of anger, but out of clarity, you reclaim a part of yourself that had been slowly dissolving. You rediscover the version of you that doesn't beg for reassurance, doesn't wait for breadcrumbs, doesn't tolerate emotional inconsistency as a form of devotion. You rise into a new understanding of what you deserve, a love grounded in reciprocity, not resistance, a bond built on openness, not evasion, a relationship where closeness is not feared but welcomed. You step into the understanding that your value was never diminished by someone else's inability to meet you. And as you walk forward, you realize something profound, that letting go isn't losing. It's choosing. Choosing yourself, choosing emotional safety, choosing connection that energizes instead of drains, choosing a love where your heart doesn't have to speak louder just to be heard. And once you choose yourself fully, the dynamic with every human in your life changes. You stop settling. You stop shrinking. You stop waiting for clarity from people who communicate through confusion. You become the person who finally says, I am done chasing. I am done explaining. I am done interpreting silence as love. I choose a life and a love that chooses me back. Thank you for giving your time, your heart, and your willingness to grow. What you just listened to wasn't just motivation. It was a reclamation of your voice, your worth, and your emotional truth. If no one has told you today, let me be the one to say it. You deserve a love that meets you, not one that flees from you. You deserve presence, not excuses. You deserve connection that breathes, not a bond that suffocates. Take what you've learned here and let it guide you into relationships where you no longer carry the emotional weight alone. You are stronger than you think, wiser than you know, and more valuable than any silence that ever tried to convince you otherwise. Thank you for listening, thank you for growing, and thank you for choosing yourself. Goodbye for now, but not forever. Your journey forward begins here.